welcome to Real Talk with the Gile Group. Today we wanted to talk on the podcast a little bit about acronyms that we use in real estate, different contingencies that the transaction goes through, whether you're a seller but it's been 5, 10, 15 years, 30 years since you sold your home. It's been a while since you've gone through the process. Guaranteed it's had some changes for sure. And not only changes, but you don't remember all of the ins and outs, and we throw acronyms around like crazy, like a foreign language, basically. So we thought we would share some of that today and talk a little bit about acronyms and contingencies. And so one that I throw out quite a bit is a CMA. Yep. And people are like, CMA? What does that mean? Comparable market analysis. It's also called,
some people call it competitive
market analysis.
Yeah.
Either way, no matter what you name it, it is a analysis of the neighborhood of a property that is within a 1 mile radius. Typically, we go anywhere from 3 months to 6 months back when we're looking at those properties. Comparable in age, comparable in size, bedrooms, bathrooms, garages, and then also square. Did I say? I said size.
Yeah, size. I mean, features. We try to keep it comparable in features or finishes. Or sometimes we'll pick some houses that have a lower level of finishes or more dated, and some maybe that are higher level. Because what we're trying to do is set this range to give either the buyer or seller a good idea of the house should be somewhere here. In this range, at market value.
Yeah. So that's a CMA. There's how many acronyms? Think of something.
Well, I know one we throw out there, and it's towards the end of the contract. It's the lenders throw it out there. It's called a CD.
Oh yeah.
It's like, what is a CD? It's like, well, the lender's going to send you a CD. No, they're not going to send you a CD in the mail. What they're going to do is send you a closing disclosure, which is kind of like the final numbers to make sure that everything adds up on your transaction, that you know what the loan amounts are, the closing costs are, and all those types of things.
Yeah, and there's little ins and outs with that one as well, because the CD has to go out, needs to be acknowledged by the buyer, and then they can't sign their final documents for 3 days. So there's little nuances in and out a transaction for sure. Contingencies. You want to do another?
Yeah, another one.
Okay, throw another one out there.
HOA.
Oh, HOA. One of my faves.
Oh yeah, and there's it depends on the property. I mean, there's some HOAs are very.
What does it stand for?
Oh, it's an HOA, don't you know? Homeowners Association.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, some are pretty straightforward. They may be mowing a little grass and taking care of a sign, and they're pretty low. And some are very complicated. So there's a lot to them.
Depends on the common area and how much common area they take care of, as to where that dollar amount goes. And the dollar amount, importantly, when you're qualifying for a loan, actually the HOA is part of that qualification. So it's important to understand what that dollar amount is going in. There's a lot. HOA is a whole nother podcast, which we will actually cover.
I'm going to get on my soapbox just a little bit about HOAs, because we'll sometimes have buyers go.
All right, everybody sit back, grab a coffee, take a sip. It'll just take a minute.
I hear, I don't want any property than HOA. You know what? HOAs have a purpose. And then a lot of cases, especially if you're looking at a townhome or something like that, I mean, they are keeping the building updated or doing some sort of, they're adding value. If there's an HOA, especially if you have like a townhouse or a condo, that's maintenance you don't have to do yourself.
Yep. There is definitely benefits to an HOA, but on the flip side, I get it. It's like, well, I don't want to have to ask you if I want to paint my house a certain color. Yeah. For the most part, I think most of them are relatively reasonable requests. Yeah, I mean, in a way, you don't want somebody painting their house chartreuse, which is bright green. Or maybe you do. I don't know. But I wouldn't want a chartreuse. No. So they do have their place. Are you done with your soapbox?
I am. I'll get off my soapbox. Let's roll into contingencies. It's probably a good place to go.
Okay. So contingencies in a transaction. And this holds true for a seller or for a buyer. Both sides, you're going to go through the contingencies. Seller, it's important to understand when the buyer has to make these decisions and when potentially a deal might fall apart, or at least have to go back to the negotiation table. So you want to do the contingencies?
Yeah, I'll start with one. I mean, one of the...
the first one. Let's do it in order.
All right, well, that's right. I thought I'd start with the end one. Let's talk about the financing piece at the end. No,
I know.
One of the first ones that come along is, there's two that come right off the bat, but inspection is one of the very first important ones, at least in the state of Oregon anyway. We have a 10-day period, almost 10 weeks. We have a 10 business day period, so basically 2 weeks to have the home inspected and negotiate on any and all repairs.
Yep.
And so this really opens up. It's another negotiation.
But you didn't start at the top.
Okay. I know I didn't start at the top. There's one more before it.
Yes, I thought you were going to start at the top. Okay, so I'm backing up.
Yeah, back it up.
So HOA, or not HOA, but home inspection.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But first, you get the seller property disclosures. And from a seller side, the seller actually completes the seller property disclosures. It's about 7 pages. It gets longer every year. They add another line or two or change a line. But the seller property disclosures are basically a history of what's happened on the house. Has the roof leaked? Was it repaired? Did you do any remodeling? Was there a permit pulled when that was done? This long sheet of questions, and the buyer gets those at the beginning of the transaction, and they have 5 business days in order to review it. Yeah. If they see anything there and it scares them, then they can technically terminate the transaction based on the SPDs, another acronym, seller property disclosures. So actually, I've never had anyone do that in the 16 years I've been doing it. I don't think you've had it either. No. But it is a contingency and it is possible. So that's the first one.
It is. And actually, here's why I didn't throw it out as the first one. Because I represent buyers a lot.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. There was a method to my madness. So I represent buyers a lot, and one of the first things we have to worry about or be concerned about is the inspection and getting that book and getting into there. I've had transactions where the seller hasn't sent us the property disclosures until a week or 4 before closing, and quite frankly, bad on them because we could get all the way into there, and if we want to back out, we could back out on that contingency a week before closing because they didn't send them timely, and they're stuck.
It's important.
It is. I can't tell you how many times I've seen them come in late.
I'm going to make a note because this is the second thought of HOA. We're definitely going to do podcasts for HOA. But the other piece is determining your realtor. And I'm going to make sure that we do a podcast on that because that's important. That's part of our job, my job as the listing agent, to make sure that those seller property disclosures go out at the top of the transaction. Right. That's important because that contingency does not start until those seller property disclosures are delivered. Right. So it's very important to understand, maybe even ask some of those questions. So hopefully we're helping people out there. If even if you're not going to use us, which of course we want you to, but even if you're not going to, we're giving you some information, questions to ask, and understanding the order in which all of this happens. Yeah, so SPD. Go ahead.
I had a buyer last fall, and the transaction was a little bit dicey. There's some things coming up, and we'd already gone through inspections, and there's some things like I don't know if this is going to work out right or not. And the seller hadn't sent us the disclosures, and we were at a point where we could have pulled the plug.
You could have.
We could have. We did. We ultimately worked. We put the deal together. We resolved the issues that the buyer had, but the seller left themselves open and at risk.
Yeah, and that's what we don't want to do. Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway.
So SPDs, seller property disclosures, home inspection.
Yeah. Finance.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, there's actually 2 pieces of finance. First of all, the property needs to appraise for the value that you're paying for it. If it's a finance transaction, this doesn't apply if it's a cash transaction.
Right.
And the finance contingency doesn't apply if you're paying cash. But if you're financing the property, there's 2 pieces to the financial contingency. So it has to appraise. The lender's going to send out an appraiser. They're going to do a report similar to the CMA that we did. That's going to look at different properties around and determine that it doesn't have the value or not. If it has the value, that's great. We move forward and go with that piece of the contingency. If it doesn't come in at value, now we're at another negotiating point in the transaction. We'll go back to the seller and say, hey, Mr. Seller, the home didn't appraise. We would like you to reduce the price. Or if the seller says no, we may go, okay. The buyer then has the choice of making up the difference in the appraisal at closing, or you terminate the transaction.
Right.
So that's one piece of the finance.
Yeah. And with an asterisk that in today's market, we're seeing a lot of buyers guarantee the price difference, if there is one, between the offer price and the appraised price. So anywhere between the list price, this is going to get confusing, list price, offer price, appraisal price could come in the middle, and the buyer is making up the difference. Again, that's a third podcast that I've now come up with in this one.
Historically,
but I just want to make that little caveat.
Historically, the risk would fall back. The appraisal risk would fall back on the seller.
That's right.
In this market, a lot of sellers are pushing that appraisal risk back to the buyer.
Yep. And then the second piece of the financing is that the buyer, the offer is contingent all the way through the end of the transaction, with the buyer having to qualify on their financing. If for some reason at the last minute something happens, and the lender tells the buyer you're no longer qualified, they actually can terminate the transaction, and then it would go back to on the market. So that contingency follows all the way through. But
and I guess one thing we didn't really talk about here, and as you're saying that, I kind of remembered, it's like we didn't talk about earnest money because it's not a contingency, but earnest money is money that the buyer puts forward and it's held at escrow and ultimately goes to the down payment.
Correct.
But if a transaction fails for these contingencies that we're just talking about, the buyer typically would be eligible to get their earnest money back.
Right.
Now, if they get kind of crazy and go, I just have cold feet and I just don't want to buy it, or something like that, they're at risk of losing their earnest money. But if the transaction fails due to one of these contingencies, it's in a situation where they get their earnest money back.
Yes, they're eligible to get their earnest money back. Yes, that's true. The goal is always to try and keep the deal together in the best interest of both parties, and make sure that both parties are happy. But I guess if we're representing the buyer, you definitely want your buyer to be happy. If you're representing the seller, you need your seller to be happy. But the goal is to get the deal closed. And the important thing is, too, as well, the listing agent, the buyer's agent are supposed to be keeping track all the way through and making sure that if there's a hiccup, things are handled and there's a solution, or at least a couple of solutions. And then if ultimately it can't be, then we're communicating. But that it won't work. But for the most part, we can get through all of these working together, everyone working together to accomplish the transaction to a close.
So have you ever had a buyer do something like maybe a week before closing, go, oh, I need some new appliances and stuff, and go out and charge them?
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that.
Really?
Don't buy a Ferrari. Don't buy a refrigerator. Don't buy anything on credit. Don't do anything financially without clearing it with your lender first. Yeah. But that's a whole nother story. Yeah. So speaking of lenders, I think that's the fourth podcast idea.
Right.
Anyway, thanks for joining us today. Hope this was helpful. We love comments down below, or you can DM us with any questions as well.
Talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching our podcast today, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on our social media.
Have questions about the real estate market? Send us an email at askgilegroup@gilegroup.com, or give us a call or shoot us a text.